Combine the market value of Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Saudi Aramco. You still won't reach the valuation of a company most people have never heard of. A 400-year-old Dutch firm worth $7.9 trillion at its peak, more than double today's most valuable company. When we think of capitalism, and old money names like Rothschild and Rockefeller dominate the conversation. But those figures didn't invent the model. They followed a blueprint created by a quiet dynasty that still reigns today. This isn't conspiracy. This is the architecture of modern finance, and its origins have been hiding in plain sight. The year is 1602. In a small Dutch city, something is happening that will reshape human civilization. 7 competing trading companies are merging into a single entity. They're pooling ships, capital, and ambition into what will become the world's first corporation. They don't know it yet, but they're inventing capitalism. The company they create will become worth $7.9 trillion in today's money. For comparison, Nvidia, currently the world's most valuable company, is worth roughly half of that. This Dutch firm will command private armies larger than most nations. It will sign international treaties. It will govern entire colonies. And it will create financial instruments that still control how money moves around the globe 4 centuries later. The company was called the VOC, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, in English, the Dutch East India Company. Here's a number that should fundamentally reshape how you understand economic power. At its peak, over 1 million people departed the Netherlands for Asia, not as explorers or settlers chasing dreams, but as employees of a corporation. Sailors, clerks, soldiers, craftsmen. They weren't serving a king, they were serving shareholders. They were building an empire not for a crown, but for dividends. Jan van Riebeeck still remembered the exact moment he understood what he was part of. He was 33 years old in 1652, standing on the deck of a VOC ship as it approached the Cape of Good Hope. The company had ordered him to establish a supply station, a rest stop for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. He looked at the African coastline and realized he wasn't just a merchant. He was an instrument of something larger than any kingdom. The settlement he founded would eventually become Cape Town. The company he served would reshape continents. What most people get wrong about the birth of capitalism is this: they think it evolved naturally from medieval trade guilds and Renaissance banking. That's the storybook version. The reality is more calculated. Capitalism wasn't discovered, it was engineered. And it was engineered not to create wealth for citizens, but to wage war without crowns. Here's a question worth sitting with: if a corporation can sign international treaties, raise armies, and govern colonies, what exactly separates it from a nation? The answer in the case of the VOC is almost nothing. The company received a charter from the Dutch government that read more like a mandate for sovereign rule than a business license. Full control over Dutch trade in Asia. The power to build forts, wage war, negotiate with foreign governments, and administer justice over its own territories. This wasn't a trading company. This was an imperial state disguised as a corporation. Peter Hartzenk was 41 when he invested his life savings in VOC shares in 1610. He was a cloth merchant in Amsterdam, not wealthy, but comfortable enough to take a risk on this new financial instrument called stock. He still remembered the exact moment he received his first dividend payment, 12% return in a single year. His hands trembled as he counted the coins. He had never earned money simply by owning something. By 1620, his initial investment had tripled. His grandchildren would inherit shares that would pay dividends for another century. Peter never sailed to Asia. He never touched spices. But he profited from every ship that returned. If you could see a chart showing the organizational structure of the VOC in 1650, you would see something remarkably familiar. A board of directors, 17 men called the Heren 17th. Regional managers across multiple continents. A permanent capital structure that didn't dissolve when founding partners died. Limited liability that protected shareholders from losses beyond their investment. Professional management separated from ownership. You would see, in other words, the template for every modern corporation on Earth. But behind the merchants and the shareholders, someone else was watching. Someone was quietly ensuring this experiment in financial warfare survived. Frederick Hendrik was 56 years old in 1640, the Prince of Orange and stadholder of the Dutch Republic. He held no kingdom. The House of Orange had no lands to rule, no mines to drain, no feudal inheritance to rely on. They were nobility in a republic run by merchants squeezed between Amsterdam's commercial elites and Spanish armies trying to extinguish their dynasty. Frederick still remembered the exact moment he understood what the VOC represented. He was reviewing reports of the company's military victories in Asia, their capture of Portuguese trading posts, their fortification of key straits. Private capital had built something his ancestors could never have afforded with crown revenues. The House of Orange couldn't run the VOC, but they could bankroll it, they could protect it, and they could tie their family's future to its success. That decision would echo for 400 years. Now contrast Frederick with someone on the other side of the VOC's expansion. Raden Wijaya was a Javanese trader 42 years old in 1619 when VOC forces established their headquarters at what would become Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. He still remembered the exact moment the Dutch ships appeared on the horizon, their cannons already trained on the coast. Within months, his family's trading network, built over 3 generations, was destroyed. The VOC didn't compete with local merchants. It eliminated them. Raden lost everything: his ships, his warehouses, his connections. He died in poverty watching foreign shareholders grow wealthy from trade routes his ancestors had pioneered. Same company, same decade, same mechanism. Winner and loser separated by geography and the direction of capital flow. Here's the question that will shape everything that follows. If the VOC invented the architecture of corporate power, and that architecture still dominates global finance today, then who built the VOC? Who engineered this system? And what happened to the families who designed it? The answer involves a dynasty that held no crowns, but accumulated more power than most monarchies. A family that learned centuries before anyone else that capital could be more potent than kingdoms. That family is still operating, and you've probably never heard their name. We ended part 1 with a question: who built the VOC, and what happened to the families who designed it? The answer involves a dynasty that held no crowns but accumulated more power than most monarchies. A family that learned centuries before anyone else that capital could be more potent than kingdoms. Now let's understand exactly how that mechanism worked, because once you see it, you'll recognize it operating everywhere today. To understand why the VOC was created, you first need to understand the existential crisis facing the Dutch in 1580. That year, Spain absorbed Portugal in a personal union. Overnight, 2 global empires merged under a single monarchy. Spain now controlled vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They controlled the spice trade. They controlled the shipping lanes. They controlled almost everything that mattered in global commerce. The Dutch were technically part of Spain at this time, but they were fighting a desperate war for independence. Now they faced something worse than war. They faced economic annihilation. Think of it like a small business suddenly discovering that their 2 biggest competitors have merged into a single giant. You can't outspend them. You can't outfight them. Your only option is to invent a completely new way of competing. That's exactly what the Dutch did. They built a weapon that had never existed before the joint stock corporation. Here's how the mechanism works. Before 1602, trading expeditions were funded, voyage by voyage. Wealthy merchants would pool money for a single trip. If the ship returned, everyone split the profits. If the ship sank, everyone lost everything. The risk was enormous, and it limited how much any individual would invest. The VOC changed this completely. Instead of funding single voyages, investors bought shares in a permanent company. The company owned the ships, employed the sailors, and managed all operations. Investors simply held pieces of paper representing ownership shares that could be bought and sold on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first. Willem Usselincx was 45 in 1602, a Flemish merchant who had fled Spanish persecution. He still remembered the exact moment he grasped what the VOC represented. He was watching investors buy and sell VOC shares at a coffee house in Amsterdam. "They're trading ownership of ships they've never seen," he muttered to a friend, "of voyages that haven't happened yet, of profits that might never exist." His friend shrugged. "That's the genius. They're trading future possibilities, not present realities." Usselincx would later help create the West India Company using the same model. He understood the mechanism could be replicated endlessly. What most people get wrong about the invention of stocks is this. They think it was designed to raise money for business expansion. That's only half the story. The deeper purpose was to spread risk across thousands of investors while concentrating power in a small group of managers. The shareholders carried the risk. The Heren 17, the 17 directors, made the decisions. Ordinary investors funded imperial conquest, but they never controlled it. If you could see the ownership structure of the VOC visualized as a pyramid, you would see something striking. At the bottom, thousands of shareholders from all walks of Dutch society. Bakers, craftsmen, widows with small inheritances. In the middle, wealthy merchant families who held larger stakes and influence. At the top, the 17 directors who made all strategic decisions. And behind them, almost invisible, the House of Orange, providing political protection and military backing. Here's a question worth sitting with. Who really owns a corporation when ownership is dispersed among thousands, while control is concentrated in a few? This question was never resolved. It just became the foundation of modern corporate governance. Now let's talk about the family that understood this mechanism better than anyone. The House of Orange in 1600 was a dynasty in crisis. They held the title of stadtholder, essentially a chief magistrate in the Dutch Republic. But the Republic was run by merchants, not nobles. The Orange family had no kingdom, no feudal lands, no traditional sources of aristocratic wealth. They were being squeezed from every direction. Amsterdam's merchant elite wanted them marginalized. Spain wanted them dead. Maurits van Nassau was 34 in 1601, the Prince of Orange and military commander of the Dutch forces. He still remembered the exact moment he understood his family's survival depended on the merchant class, not on traditional nobility. He was reviewing military budgets, watching money flow from Amsterdam's trading houses to fund his armies. Without merchant capital, he couldn't pay soldiers. Without soldiers, he couldn't protect the merchants. The relationship was symbiotic, but it was also a trap. If the merchants ever decided they didn't need the House of Orange, his family would be finished. Maurits made a strategic decision that would echo for centuries. He tied his family's fortunes directly to the trading companies. The House of Orange didn't run the VOC, they didn't have the merchant expertise, but they bankrolled it, they protected it politically, they lent it military credibility, and in return, they received something more valuable than salary, they received leverage. Remember Peter Hartzink from Part 1, the cloth merchant whose VOC investment tripled by 1620. His 12% dividend came from a system where the House of Orange guaranteed military protection for VOC operations. Peter's profits and the Orange family's power were financially entangled, even though Peter never knew it. Here's the twist that most histories miss. The VOC wasn't just a private company using state resources. It was a public-private hybrid where the lines between government, military, and commerce were intentionally blurred. The company had a state charter but private shareholders. It had government-backed military force but commercial objectives. It answered to the Heren 7, but the Heren 7 needed the stadtholder's political protection. This hybrid model was the innovation that changed everything, and it's still the model used by the world's most powerful institutions today. Decades after Maurits, his descendants made the relationship official. William IV and William V, both from the House of Orange, served as presidents of both the VOC and the West India Company. Not symbolic positions. Operational leadership, The family that once had no kingdom now presided over the two most powerful corporations on earth. Adriana van Heusden was 38 in 1750, a widow in Rotterdam who had inherited VOC shares from her late husband. She still remembered the exact moment she learned that the company's president was also the Prince of Orange. She was attending a shareholders' meeting when the announcement was made. Around her, wealthy merchants nodded approvingly. Adriana felt something else unease. The company that owned her financial future was now inseparable from the state. "If the company falls," she whispered to her daughter, "does the nation fall with it?" It was a prescient question. The answer would come decades later. The mechanism the Dutch created: publicly traded shares. Limited liability, professional management, corporate governance, state-backed private enterprise didn't stay in Amsterdam. It spread across the world. To London, where the Bank of England would be founded using similar principles. To New York, which was originally New Amsterdam before the English took it. To every stock exchange and multinational corporation on the planet. The Dutch didn't just create a company. They created the operating system for modern capitalism. But every operating system has vulnerabilities. And by the late 1700s, the VOC was about to discover what happens when a corporation built for conquest faces a world that no longer wants to be conquered. The cracks were already showing. And what collapsed wasn't just a company, it was the first demonstration that too big to fail was always a lie. We ended part 2 with the VOC facing cracks in its foundation. By the late 1700s, the first demonstration that too big to fail was always a lie was about to unfold. Now let's watch what happens when a corporate empire built for conquest meets its limits, because the story we're told about the VOC's decline is not the story that actually happened. The official narrative says the VOC collapsed because of corruption, mismanagement, and changing global markets. That's the textbook version. The reality is more disturbing. The VOC didn't fail because it was poorly run. It failed because the extraction model that made it successful was designed to be unsustainable. The machine was built to consume, not to create. And when there was nothing left to consume, the machine ate itself. But before it collapsed, it destroyed millions of lives, and the shareholders kept collecting dividends until the very end. Let me show you how the mechanism actually operated on the ground. The Banda Islands are a small archipelago in present-day Indonesia. In 1621, they were the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. The VOC wanted a monopoly on nutmeg. It was worth more than gold in European markets. The Bandanese people had traded spices for centuries, building complex relationships with merchants across Asia. The VOC decided those people were an obstacle. John Petersoen Cohen was 40 years old in 1621, the Governor-General of the VOC's Asian operations. He still remembered the exact moment he gave the order. He was standing on the deck of a VOC warship, watching the Banda Islands grow closer on the horizon. His instructions from Amsterdam were clear: secure the monopoly by any means necessary. Any means meant genocide. Within months, VOC soldiers had killed approximately 15,000 Bandanese, nearly the entire indigenous population. The survivors were enslaved. The VOC replaced them with Dutch settlers and enslaved workers from other regions. Cohen wrote to Amsterdam with clinical satisfaction. The islands are now at peace. If you could see a chart showing VOC dividends during this period, you would see them climbing steadily. 15% returns, 20% returns. The Amsterdam shareholders, including members of the House of Orange, collected their profits. They didn't ask where the nutmeg came from. They didn't ask why the supply suddenly became so stable. Remember Peter Hartsink from Part 1, the cloth merchant whose investment tripled. His dividends came from this. Every guilder of profit was connected to extraction, to forced labor, to violence that shareholders never witnessed and could easily ignore. Here's the question that should haunt every investor today: when you own shares in a company, what are you actually owning? The answer often is a claim on extraction that happens far from where you live. The VOC didn't limit itself to the Banda Islands. The Batavia Massacre of 1740 killed approximately 10,000 Chinese civilians in what is now Jakarta. The Amboina Massacre executed English and Japanese traders. Forced labor systems across Java, Ceylon, and Bengal compelled indigenous populations to cultivate crops for company profit, while their own communities starved. What most people get wrong about colonial corporations is this: they think the violence was incidental, a side effect of doing business in rough conditions. The violence wasn't incidental. It was the business model. The VOC was cheaper to operate when it eliminated competitors rather than outcompeting them. It was more profitable when it enslaved workers rather than paying them. The shareholders benefited from every atrocity, whether they knew it or not. Pause and consider what that means. The financial innovation we celebrate, joint stock corporations, publicly traded shares, limited liability, was field-tested on genocide. The mechanisms that power modern capitalism were perfected by a company that exterminated populations for market share. The tools survived. The bodies didn't. Now here's the twist that explains why the VOC collapsed despite its brutality. By the mid-1700s, the extraction model had reached its limits. There were no more easy conquests. The spice trade was facing competition from British and French companies. Military costs were escalating. And inside the VOC, something else was happening. The managers were extracting from the company the same way the company extracted from its colonies. Adrianus Moens was 53 in 1770, a mid-level VOC administrator in Batavia. He still remembered the exact moment he understood the company was hollowing itself out. He was reviewing shipping manifests and noticed discrepancies. Goods that should have reached Amsterdam never arrived. Cargoes were being diverted. Officials were running private trades on company ships. "Everyone is stealing," he wrote to a friend in Holland. "From the governor-general down to the dock workers, the company is being eaten from within." Moens reported the corruption to his superiors. Nothing happened. The superiors were the ones stealing. Remember Adriana van Hoosten from Part 2, the widow who asked whether the company and the nation would fall together? Her question was about to be answered. By the 1780s, the VOC was technically insolvent. It owed more than it owned. The dividends that shareholders like Adriana depended on were being paid not from profits, but from new debt and accounting tricks. The company was running a Ponzi scheme, paying old investors with new investors' money 2 centuries before the term was invented. Here's the rage-inducing part. While the company was collapsing, while it was clear to insiders that the end was coming, the directors continued paying themselves enormous salaries. The Heeren 17th awarded themselves bonuses while cutting costs everywhere else. They sold off company assets to connected buyers at favorable prices. They positioned their families to survive the collapse that would devastate ordinary shareholders. Hendrik Fagel was 61 in 1795, a retired schoolteacher in Leiden, whose entire pension depended on VOC dividend payments. He still remembered the exact moment he learned the payments would stop. His wife found him at the kitchen table holding the letter from his broker. The VOC had been nationalized by the Dutch government. His shares were worthless. 50 years of dividend income gone. His wife asked what they would do. Hendrik had no answer. He died 3 years later, impoverished, having given his productive years to a system that discarded him when he was no longer useful. Meanwhile, the families who had run the VOC for generations, the merchant dynasties, the connected directors, the House of Orange emerged largely intact. Their wealth had diversified over decades. Their political connections remained strong. The company died. The power structure survived. If you could see a visualization of wealth distribution in the Netherlands from 1795 to 1850, you would see something disturbing. The VOC's collapse destroyed the savings of middle-class investors like Hendrik. But the top tier, the families who had controlled the company, maintained their position. They pivoted to new industries, new investments, new opportunities. The collapse was a filter that eliminated small shareholders while preserving elite wealth. Same pattern, same mechanism, different century. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the VOC's corporate structure allowed insiders to profit while ordinary shareholders were destroyed, has that structure actually changed? The VOC was formally dissolved in 1799. But here's the twist that rarely gets mentioned. The dissolution wasn't really a death. It was a transformation. The Dutch government absorbed the VOC's debts, its territories, its administrative apparatus. The officials who had run the company became officials who ran the colonial state. The trading networks continued. The extraction continued. Only the legal structure changed. Laurens van Meerop was 44 in 1800, a former VOC administrator who seamlessly transitioned to government service. He still remembered the exact moment he realized the VOC wasn't gone, it had metamorphosed. He was sitting in the same office, managing the same territories, using the same accounting systems. "We changed the letterhead," he told a colleague. "Nothing else changed." The colleague laughed. They both knew it was true. The VOC didn't collapse. It became the Dutch colonial state which continued operating until Indonesia's independence in 1949. The corporate model was absorbed into government. The wealth extraction continued. The descendants of the original shareholders and directors maintained their positions. And the House of Orange. They emerged from the VOC era stronger than they entered. The family that had bankrolled corporate imperialism would soon become the constitutional monarchy of the Netherlands, a position they still hold today. The company worth $7.9 trillion is gone. But the families who built it, the mechanisms they created, and the financial architecture they designed didn't disappear. They evolved. They adapted. And they're still operating in ways that would be very familiar to anyone who understood the VOC. What happened next isn't just historical aftermath. It's the blueprint for how Dutch financial power would reshape itself for the modern world. We ended Part 3 with a realization the VOC didn't die, it metamorphosed. The company worth $7.9 trillion dissolved. But the families who built it, the mechanisms they created, and the financial architecture they designed evolved and adapted. They're still operating today. Now let's trace that evolution forward, because understanding what happened after 1799 explains why a country smaller than California now commands more capital than most empires ever dreamed of. The VOC's formal dissolution in 1799 wasn't an ending. It was a transformation so seamless that most historians miss it entirely. The company's debts became national debts. The company's territories became government colonies. The company's officials became colonial administrators. And the families who had profited from the VOC pivoted their wealth into new structures that would prove even more durable. If you could see a family tree of Dutch financial power from 1600 to the present, you would see something remarkable. The same surnames appearing generation after generation. Not all of them, of course. Some families rose and fell. But the core network the families tied to the Heren Sextedient, the merchant dynasties connected to the House of Orange, maintained their position across 4 centuries. They adapted to every crisis, every revolution, every transformation of the global economy. The pattern isn't collapse and rebuilding. It's continuous evolution. Let me show you how this played out in human terms. Remember Hendrik Fagel from Part 3, the retired schoolteacher whose VOC shares became worthless when the company was nationalized. Let me tell you what happened to his family. Hendrik died in 1798, impoverished, leaving his widow and 3 children with almost nothing. His daughter Maria married a factory worker. His grandchildren worked manual labor jobs. By 1850, the Fagel family had descended from comfortable middle class to working poor. By 1900, they had no meaningful wealth to pass on. The chain of capital accumulation, the compounding that builds generational prosperity, was broken in 1795 and never recovered. Now contrast that with a different family from the same era. Johannes Goldberg was 56 in 1795, a director of the VOC with inside knowledge of the coming dissolution. He still remembered the exact moment he began protecting his family's wealth. It was 1790, 5 years before the end, and the Heren 16th were meeting to discuss the company's deteriorating finances. Goldberg looked around the room and realized every man there was quietly positioning himself for the aftermath. That night, he began converting VOC assets into land government bonds and positions in emerging industries. By 1799, when the VOC dissolved, Goldberg had diversified completely. His VOC shares were worthless, but they represented a fraction of his portfolio. His grandchildren inherited substantial wealth. By 1850, the Goldberg family had expanded into colonial trading textiles and early industrial manufacturing. By 1900, they were part of the financial establishment. The chain of capital accumulation continued unbroken. Same company, same collapse, same era. Opposite generational outcomes. The difference wasn't intelligence or hard work. The difference was information. Insiders knew what was coming. Outsiders believed the official story until it was too late. What most people get wrong about financial collapses is this: they think everyone loses equally. They don't. Collapses are filters. They destroy the wealth of ordinary people while preserving, sometimes concentrating, the wealth of those with insider access. The VOC's dissolution didn't reduce inequality, it increased it. Here's a question worth sitting with: if the pattern has repeated for 4 centuries, what makes anyone believe it won't continue? Now let's trace the mechanism forward to the modern era. In 1907, something happened that should be studied more carefully. Royal Dutch Petroleum merged with Shell Transport and Trading Company to form Royal Dutch Shell. Notice the name Royal Dutch. This wasn't accidental branding. The House of Orange had connections to Dutch petroleum interests from the beginning. The family that had bankrolled the VOC 3 centuries earlier now had ties to a new global resource monopoly. Cornelis van Alst was 43 in 1907, a Dutch banker who helped structure the Royal Dutch Shell merger. He still remembered the exact moment he recognized the historical echo. He was reviewing the corporate documents and noticed the governance structure: Dutch-controlled management, British capital, global extraction operations. "It's the VOC," he murmured to a colleague. "Same architecture, different century." The colleague didn't understand. Van Alst didn't explain. Some things were better left unspoken. If you could see a chart comparing the organizational structure of the VOC in 1650 and Royal Dutch Shell in 1950, the similarities would be striking. A board of directors making strategic decisions. Professional management separated from ownership. Global operations extracting resources from distant territories. Shareholders in Europe collecting dividends from wealth created elsewhere. Limited liability protecting investors from consequences of corporate actions. The mechanism didn't change. Only the product changed from spices to petroleum. Today, the Netherlands isn't a seafaring empire. It's a financial empire. And the numbers are staggering. Foreign direct investment into the Netherlands, $4.3 trillion. Foreign direct investment from the Netherlands, $5.2 trillion. Dutch holdings abroad, $3.5 trillion. For a country with fewer people than California, these numbers represent an outsized influence on global capital flows. The Netherlands is a financial gateway, a place where money passes through on its way from one jurisdiction to another. Here's the twist that most financial journalists miss: much of this isn't really Dutch money. The Netherlands has structured itself as a conduit, a pass-through, a place where multinational corporations route transactions to minimize taxes and maximize flexibility. The same corporate architecture that made the VOC powerful hybrid structures, blurring public and private, national and international, now makes the Netherlands a center of global capital management. Willem de Vries is 51 today, a tax attorney in Amsterdam, who helps multinational corporations structure their European operations. He still remembered the exact moment he understood what the Netherlands had become. He was explaining a complex holding structure to an American client, how profits from Asian operations could flow through a Dutch subsidiary to minimize tax obligations. The American laughed and said, So the Netherlands is basically a financial hotel. Companies check in, rearrange their money, and check out. Willem smiled politely. The American wasn't wrong. But here's the question that matters: who benefits from this arrangement? The answer is complicated. The Netherlands collects fees and employment lawyers, accountants, administrators managing the flows. Multinational corporations reduce their tax obligations. But the countries where actual extraction happens, where resources are mined, where products are manufactured, where labor is performed, often see less benefit than they should. The mechanism is familiar. Wealth created in one place flows to financial centers, where it's managed, protected, and accumulated. The VOC extracted spices from Indonesia and delivered profits to Amsterdam. Modern multinationals extract value from operations worldwide and route profits through Dutch structures. Same pattern, 4 centuries apart. Now let's bring this to the present moment. The House of Orange still reigns. King Willem-Alexander ascended the throne in 2013. The monarchy is ceremonial, but the family's connections are anything but symbolic. They maintain stakes in companies. They participate in foundations and investment vehicles. They attend forums where global policy is shaped. The dynasty that bankrolled the VOC in 1602 remains at the center of Dutch economic power in 2024. Maria Vanderburg is 38 today, a financial analyst in Rotterdam, studying Dutch corporate ownership patterns. She still remembered the exact moment she noticed the historical continuity. She was mapping shareholder networks for major Dutch corporations and kept finding the same family names, descendants of VOC-era merchant dynasties, connected through foundations, trusts, and interlocking directorates. These families have been wealthy for 400 years, she told a colleague. The mechanisms change, but the positions don't. Her colleague shrugged. That's capitalism. Maria shook her head. No, that's something else. That's architecture. The VOC is gone, but the operating system it created, joint stock corporations, publicly traded shares, limited liability, hybrid public-private structures, financial pass-through arrangements, remains the foundation of global capitalism. The question isn't whether this system still operates. The question is whether it can be reformed, whether the concentration it creates is inevitable, and whether the patterns we've traced across 4 centuries will continue into the future. Those questions don't have easy answers, but they become clearer when you understand where the system came from. And that brings us back to the present, to what all of this means for the world we're living in right now. We ended part 4 with questions whether the system can be reformed, whether the concentration it creates is inevitable, and whether patterns that have persisted for 4 centuries will continue into the future. Now let's bring this full circle to you, to the present moment, to what all of this means for the world we're living in right now. The VOC was dissolved 225 years ago. But if you look at the architecture of global finance today, really look at it, you'll see the VOC everywhere. Publicly traded shares that separate ownership from control. VOC innovation. Limited liability that protects shareholders from consequences of corporate actions. VOC invention. Hybrid structures, blurring the line between private enterprise and state power. VOC blueprint. Professional management. Making decisions while dispersed shareholders carry risk. VOC template. We didn't inherit a neutral system. We inherited a system designed 4 centuries ago to concentrate wealth while distributing risk. The question isn't whether that design still operates. The question is whether we understand what we're participating in. Let me offer a framework for thinking about this, not financial advice, just questions worth asking. First, when you own shares in a company, do you know where the value comes from? Not the industry or the product, the actual source of extraction. Whose labor, whose resources, whose communities are being monetized to generate your returns. Second, when financial architecture allows profits to flow through certain jurisdictions while costs remain in others, who benefits from that architecture? Not in theory specifically. Which institutions, which families, which networks? Third, when you see a company described as Too big to fail. Ask what happened to the VOC shareholders who believed the same thing in 1790. These questions don't give answers, they give clarity. Remember John van Riebeeck from Part 1, the VOC employee who founded Cape Town in 1652, standing on the deck of a company ship, realizing he was an instrument of something larger than any kingdom. Let me tell you where his legacy leads. Van Riebeeck never owned significant VOC shares. He was an employee, not a shareholder. He built the infrastructure that generated wealth for investors in Amsterdam. Investors he never met whose names he didn't know. He died in 1677, having served the company for decades, leaving modest assets to his family. The settlement he founded became a major trading hub. The profits flowed back to the Netherlands for centuries. Today, his descendants, if any can be traced, hold no connection to that wealth. The value he created was captured by the shareholders, compounded over generations, and remains embedded in Dutch financial power. Same pattern, same mechanism, different century. If you could see a diagram showing how value flows through the modern global economy, you would see something strikingly similar to VOC trade routes. Resources and labor concentrated in certain regions. Profits flowing to financial centers. Ownership held by networks that span continents but cluster in a few jurisdictions. Here's the twist that should reshape how you think about the present. The Netherlands today has foreign direct investment flows exceeding $9 trillion, larger than its entire economy. This isn't because Dutch companies are extraordinarily productive. It's because the Netherlands has positioned itself as a financial conduit, a pass-through, a place where global capital is routed and restructured. The same nation that created the VOC now hosts the corporate architecture that multinationals use to optimize their global operations. The mechanism evolved, but it didn't disappear. Thomas Brennan is 44 today, an American working for a multinational corporation with European headquarters structured through Dutch entities. He still remembered the exact moment he understood what that structure meant. He was in a training session about corporate tax optimization, watching diagrams of how profits from Asian manufacturing flowed through Dutch holding companies to minimize obligations. "Why the Netherlands?" he asked. The presenter smiled. "History, infrastructure. They've been doing this longer than anyone." Thomas laughed along with the room, but later alone in his hotel, he thought about what longer than anyone actually meant. 4 centuries of practice. That's not just expertise, that's architecture embedded so deep it's invisible. What most people get wrong about modern finance is this: they think it's new. They think the complexity is recent. They think the mechanisms are products of the last few decades. But the core architecture, the joint stock corporation, the separation of ownership and control, the limited liability that shields investors from consequences, is 400 years old. We're not using new tools. We're using very old tools that have been refined over centuries. Remember Raden Wijaya from Part 1, the Javanese trader whose family network was destroyed when the VOC established headquarters at what became Jakarta. His descendants today live in modern Indonesia. Some are successful, some are not. But none of them own shares in Shell or ING or the other Dutch corporations that still profit from operations in their region. The wealth that was extracted over centuries never returned. It compounded somewhere else. The House of Orange still reigns. King Willem-Alexander opened the Dutch Parliament last year. The ceremony is medieval, but the power is thoroughly modern. The royal family maintains connections to Dutch industry through foundations, trusts, and investment vehicles. The dynasty that backed the VOC in 1602 remains embedded in the financial establishment of 2024. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the same families and institutions have maintained their positions across 4 centuries of supposed disruption through revolutions, wars, technological transformations, and the rise and fall of empires, what does that tell us about the nature of the system? The signature truth of this entire story is simple: capital is more durable than crowns. The VOC understood this before anyone else. They built a system where ownership could be perpetual, where wealth could compound across generations, where position could be maintained through any disruption as long as the architecture survived. That architecture didn't just survive, it became the foundation of global finance. This video wasn't about condemning any nation or institution. The Dutch didn't invent human greed, they channeled it into remarkably durable structures. The question isn't whether those structures were wrong. The question is whether we understand them, whether we see them operating, and whether we recognize our own position within them. When we think of capitalism, we think of names like Rothschild, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. Those figures are famous, but they followed a model that was already centuries old when they arrived. The House of Orange, the Heeren-Sesvient, the merchant dynasties of Amsterdam, they wrote the blueprint. Everyone else just built on their foundation. The $7.9 trillion company is gone. But the operating system it created runs the world. And the question that should stay with you long after this video ends is the same question that has defined 4 centuries of financial history. If markets now hold the power that was once reserved for monarchs, who governs the markets, and who holds the crown when the crown is invisible?